following program is a special presentation from Home Box Office.
Your host for Time was Dick Cavett.
Good evening. When the sixth decade of the 20th century dawned in America, it was ushered in with the usual bells and horns and whistles that greet the beginning of any new year. But in 1960, that sound had a strange effect. It seemed to be an alarm clock that suddenly awakened a whole generation of dozing Americans, almost overnight, or at least it seemed that way. The silent youth of the 50s had awakened into the articulate, assertive, active young people of the 60s. The 60s generation. The generation of young people that would challenge and change the course of history. By the middle of the decade, a whole new youth subculture, they called themselves flower children, was blooming in the Haight-Ashbury section of San Francisco. The ragtag army of young people came from an amazing cross-section of American society. Runaway teenagers, middle-class college dropouts, and disillusioned stockbrokers stood and slept side by side, preaching love and making love, smoking marijuana, and living a lifestyle that was unique in American history. The great majority, the straight Americans, called the kids hippies and didn't really quite know what to make of the whole thing. But, at least at first, the hippies didn't cause much trouble, and a few older straights even thought the whole scene might be a good thing for America. From the vantage point of 1967, the hippie movement seemed to be a direct outgrowth of the almost magical involvement of American youth in national affairs, an involvement that began abruptly with the opening whistle of 1960. In the 1950s, for example, the powerful House Un-American Activities Committee could go about its business of hunting down suspected communists almost without opposition. Most Americans were frankly afraid to speak out against the committee's sometimes brutal tactics. With the dawn of 1960, HUAC, as the committee was called, didn't expect any change in the public's attitude. Early that year, they came to San Francisco, and the nation received a shock.
Open the doors, what are you afraid of? Open the doors, here comes the goose squad. This is Americanism. What's this Americanism in action?
Thousands of Bay Area students were on hand at the San Francisco City Hall as the hearings began, and they were openly protesting against the committee. A public protest against HUAC was unheard of. The disbelieving congressman ordered the police to clear the area, and the battle was on. The police attacked with clubs and high-pressure hoses. Protesters were sent sprawling down the hard marble steps of City Hall. 12 were hospitalized and 52 were arrested. More important, they became the first casualties in a battle that would eventually split the nation and topple a president. On May 13, 1960, Friday the 13th, on the steps of the San Francisco City Hall, American students began their protest. Soon other students were joining angry blacks in a tactic called a sit-in. Planting themselves at chairs and tables and lunch counters that would serve only whites, the sit-inners would refuse to move. The sit-ins quickly spread across the South and into segregated stores in the North, with college students, both black and white, leading the way. The sit-ins reached their climax in 1964 When Lester Maddox, the owner of a fried chicken diner in Georgia named the Pick Rick, passed out pick handles to his friends and then stood in the doorway of his diner with a pistol in his hand to keep out the desegregationists. The incident brought Maddox such a storm of publicity that the unknown cafe owner was elected governor of Georgia 3 years later.
They are paid agitators. They're paid to destroy the American free enterprise system.
Let's go surfing now.
The rebellion of youth was not confined.
With me. Come on, safari with me.
The rebellion of youth was not confined to politics. Protesting against the styles and morals of the 50s, a whole new wave of sexual freedom seemed to sweep the nation.
On the beach you'll find them there, in the sun and salty air. The girls on the beach are all within reach, if you know what to do.
A revolution in the way we dance was born in 1960 when a one-time chicken plucker named Ernest Evans took the name Chubby Checker and recorded something called the twist. For the first time, you didn't have to know how to dance in order to dance, and from the Peppermint Lounge in New York to the Whiskey A Go-Go in LA, people proved it every night. The number of twist songs reached into the hundreds. And then came Beatlemania. The mop-haired group from Liverpool wrote and sang a whole spectrum of songs that seemed to capture every emotion the new generation was trying to express. Their first visit to America was a sensation, a happening, an emotional love-in. The unheard-of length of their hair caused almost as much uproar as the sound of their music.
I like their music and the way they dress and their hair and their looks.
They look like girls to me.
They do not.
Oh, they don't.
They look like boys.
Especially in poems.
You hope to get a haircut at all?
No. I had one yesterday.
Other love affairs were not so durable. Nikita Khrushchev was firmly entrenched as the Soviet premier in 1960, and Dwight David Eisenhower was ending his 8 years as president. In his final effort toward world peace, Ike would sit down with Khrushchev at a summit meeting in Paris, and then climax his presidency with a friendly visit to Moscow as Khrushchev's guest. A final gesture to warm the frigid climate of the Cold War. Unfortunately, it didn't happen that way at all. The entire enterprise was shot down by an airplane that didn't carry any guns. It was called the U-2, and it could carry a man through the fringes of the atmosphere at the then incredible altitude of 65,000 feet. The U-2 was nothing else but a spy plane. It had cameras so sensitive they could photograph the headline on a newspaper 10 miles below. On May 1st, just 2 weeks before the Paris summit was to begin, a CIA pilot named Francis Gary Powers climbed into a U-2 and took off on an ill-fated spy flight over the Soviet Union. Halfway across Russia, the U-2 was detected and shot down by a Soviet missile. Powers, parachuted to safety, was captured in order to stand trial. Hoping to squeeze every bit of propaganda advantage out of the situation, the Russians threw the trial open to newsmen from around the world. Powers was found guilty and eventually served 17 months in a Soviet prison.